Two huge security challenges weigh Bosnia and Herzegovina today: the coronavirus pandemic and the presence of few thousand migrants who stalemated on the northwest border of Bosnia and Herzegovina, waiting to enter to Croatia, that means to European Union. Their final goal is to get to core countries of European Union. After the first peak of coronavirus in the period of March, April and May this year, Bosnia and Herzegovina is faced with increasing number of infected people again. Because of complex political system and different answer of Bosnia and Herzegovina in this situation, that means that situation is very diverse in different parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Republic of Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which manage situation on their own, coordinating between them very weakly. At the moment, just a little bit better is the situation in more centralized entity, the Republic of Srpska, while in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is divided in 10 self-ruled and autonomous regions named cantons, is getting worse. But average situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina is generally not good. The problem is that situation is in the entire region of Southeast Europe, that means Balkans, is also not good. Bosnia and Herzegovina is in a great trouble when we talk about migrant crisis. The tale of huge migrant crisis 2015 and 2016 shocks significantly Bosnia and Herzegovina today. Few thousand migrants came in Bosnia and Herzegovina with intention to get to Croatia as the first frontier to European Union. Their main goal is to reach core countries of European Union, dominantly Germany, but also Austria, France, Netherlands, taking account on better immigration policies and better economic situation. Almost no one of them have a wish to stay in Bosnia and Herzegovina. For difference of previous migrant movements to EU, actual groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina are very different origin. They are not mainly Syrians like before. Many of them are now from countries of Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa and others. Bosnia and Herzegovina still does not have a consequent policy when we talk about migrant crisis, while the Republic of Srpska a very strict approach in rejection any sort of presence of migrants on its soil, and at the same time Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina is more flexible with its attitudes. The main problem is lack of harmonized, clear politics, orientation and solution. Some politicians insist on the readmission and getting back them to countries of their origin. Some politicians think Bosnia and Herzegovina has to deal with the presence of migrants inside countries. There are few migrant camps that are now under constructing. At the same time, Bosnia and Herzegovina, because of migrant crisis, is also in deep internal crisis. The migrants and situation with them provoked a resignation of Minister of Security. Now it is also a huge gap when we talk about different solutions. The main migrant routes is through Serbia because many migrants get into Bosnia and Herzegovina illegally going across the Drina River. Many of them simply do not have any personal identification documents. As far as the biggest concentration of them is in the northwest cities of Bosnia and Herzegovina, waiting to go across Croatian border, because of almost full impossibility to realize their entrance to Croatia, they are forced to live in very primitive conditions, but at the same time they are a permanent source of insecurity. They attack on local people, conflicts between them are very frequent, even sometimes with a lethal outcome. They are very aggressive to local institutions and so on. At the same time, unresolved situations with migrants is a huge burden for already weak Bosnia and Herzegovina economy, regardless some assistance from EU. These threats are only two of many other challenges that Bosnia and Herzegovina faces today, such as terrorism, poverty, economy underdevelopment. In the frame of different security challenges, there is a very ambiguous situation when we talk about the accession of Bosnia and Herzegovina to Euro-Atlantic relations. In the second half of last year, the discussion of accession to NATO and to Euro-Atlantic integrations was very firm. There was a huge crisis when we talk about constitution of Council of Ministers based on two different approaches to the membership to NATO and before that to exception of membership action plans. While the representatives of the Republic of Srpska reject any possibility to get to membership action plan and to NATO, on the other hand, two representatives of other two constituent peoples like Croats and Bosniaks, they insist strongly on some exception of membership action plan and accession to NATO. There was the finally compromise solution that instead of membership action plan project, there was some sort of document which is called reform agenda is adopted, but the positions in terms of NATO accession and other relations to Euro-Atlantic integrations are still very ambiguous. There is the open space for bigger cooperation, but at the moment, Bosnia and Herzegovina is not in the line to be accepted as the NATO member.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zoan Keković. It's a great pleasure to be involved in this project, which happens in extraordinary circumstances caused by COVID-19. I will talk about some global aspects of COVID crisis from the academic perspective, and then I will tackle some of main points of how Serbia deals with this crisis. In the conditions of new crisis normality and so-called inherent uncertainty, risk and crisis management are among the most frequently used terms, both in the global academic community and in various aspects of social life in almost all countries. Following the reports of World Health Organization, no one country has been prepared for the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the shock effect of the outbreak of the COVID crisis resulted in confusing, partial, untimely, and even essentially inadequate national responses. Opening the next questions. What is it about the current crisis that makes decades of theoretical knowledge in crisis management inapplicable in practice? What is it that makes the practical skills of crisis managers inappropriate? And what are the features of the COVID-19 crisis that make it essentially incomparable with other, apparently similar and previous pandemic crises? Crisis is not a rational problem. Knowledge solves problem, but that crisis is not a rational problem. Decision-making is based on intuition rather than logic and on experience rather than analytics. Because in conditions of high uncertainty, there is no material for risk analysis, for risk prediction, for risk estimation. The degree of variability and volatility is such that rules are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Indeed, at the beginning of any crisis, even this one, the rules will retreat against the facts. Not because the existing rules are not valid, but because they are not useful and applicable. In fact, the crisis is a confirmation that the existing solutions have proved useless. Crisis events are dramatically multiplied and stubbornly deny everything that has been written so far. Actually, what is the crisis? The crisis is essentially a security issue. Let's start with that. This is situations in which the required risk response exceeds the institutional capacity of the system to the extent that the resulting circumstances may lead to irreversible damage to its vital sectors. In that regard, the crisis is a serious threat to the basic structures of or fundamental values and norms of the social systems, which in conditions of time pressure and very uncertain circumstances requires critical decisions. In 21st century, crises even tend to be more frequent and destructive, so that organization will not recover from the previous crisis before new events happen to us. If we look at the series of epidemics caused by infectious disease in the last 2 decades, we see that these events have been more frequent. Let me demonstrate that. Bam, 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 bam. Additionally, the amplitude of events and their impact is growing stronger and stronger. In a way, bam, 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 bam. That's 21st century crisis. And about COVID-19 crisis. The current crisis is a situation that was only initiated by a pandemic. Since the crisis is the product of a whole series of events than a single event, and omissions also to respond properly on initial events. The current trend of the COVID crisis announces the escalation of the destructive potential of emerging consequences and the inevitability of new, even more dangerous challenges, especially having in mind its spillover to other spheres of state and social life, political, economic, social, health, psychological, and others. What about global context of health crisis? By analyzing the data from the official report of the World Economic Forum for 2020, we come to two significant conclusions. The first is based on the fact that epidemics and pandemics are not recognized at all as one of the 10 most probable risks that the world would face, and that their impact is underestimated by being positioned only in the 10th place. This is crucial for understanding the unpreparedness to the COVID crisis globally. And the second conclusion, which is important for understanding the global, but also regional and national context of COVID crisis, is based on the fact that the world is already heavily burdened with serious technological, economic, social, geopolitical, and environmental threats which affect abilities and capacities of organization, countries to respond to the new threats. What about regional, national, local context? In addition to this global context, an adequate understanding of the specific regional, national, local environment affected by the crisis is a prerequisite for crisis management analysis. Although it is a global pandemic, different regions, countries, and even communities are characterized by different crisis dynamics. And due to the existence of different degrees of vulnerability and exposure, different needs and priorities, capacities, and resources. Given these circumstances, it is clear why decision-making from the very beginning of the COVID crisis in most countries is marked by a lack of fundamental knowledge and awareness of crisis management. In the law of catastrophe risk reduction and emergency management of the Republic of Serbia, situations such as the current epidemic are considered as a catastrophe. The fact that Serbia has not drafted and adopted a national plan for pandemics shows that learning from the crisis, as a very important part of crisis management, has been completely neglected. This legacy of the past conditioned the crisis communication during the COVID pandemic in 2020 in Serbia. And socio-political context in Serbia, example, the fact that the beginning of the pandemic coincided with the announcement of the elections and the beginning of the election campaign influenced the entire operational and political concept of crisis management and also the way of crisis communication. I would like to mention some of the main points which affect crisis leadership in Serbia. Insufficient and unreliable expertise. Is virus natural or artificial, accidentally or intentionally released? What is safety distance? Length of virus survival on different surface. How long does the incubation last? Can the virus be transmitted through cups, through plates, cutlery? Are children and young people significantly safer? Does it leave consequences and what kind? Reliability of tests also. Do masks provide protection? Should we wear gloves, etc. Next point is unclear pandemic strategies approach globally. Let's mention Swedish model laissez-faire with the hope and assumption of acquiring herd immunity. Chinese model of authoritarian state, command and control repressive measures also. Intensive contact monitoring and extensive use of ICT in Taiwan, South Korea. Low population density, strong health system and political consensus in Uruguay. Main point is lack of trust in institution as a prerequisite for effective crisis communication and good crisis leadership. We could mention in that regard dominance of ICT and various activists and interest groups in public debate. Next point is political instrumentalization of the pandemic, which include strengthening the power and autonomy of the executive, endangering the rights of citizens, using a pandemic to promote political leaders and propaganda, gathering around the flag, strengthening soft power, China, Russia, who will be the first to get the vaccine. And finally, infodemia is also important feature of this crisis, which includes myths and different conspiracy theories. What about crisis communication in Serbia? Crisis communication included risk communication is an important part of crisis management, especially in crises related to human health. Pandemics are very serious crisis situations. In them, it's very important to explain to people in an appropriate way the type of the danger and the way they should behave to minimize the risk of infections. The responsibility for this communication lies primarily with the health authorities and the holders of the highest political positions. Also, the reactions of the state and health system on this crisis have been conditioned by rather different social historical context in which these events took place. Media's roles in COVID crisis. The role of the media in the crisis as a crisis communicators is very questionable. The media spread the atmosphere of fear more than they constructively contributed to calm the situation and desired patterns of behavior. The role of experts is especially harmful when they publicly express views and cautions, which leads to decline in trust in the structure and those in state institutions. Let's conclude. The event is global, but the response is local. The question is the national response the only possible answer to the global pandemic event? My response is yes. Given the cultural but also the immunological differences, the differences in the reservoir with regard to the presence of viruses, previous experiences deposited in our archetypal fund. And there is no universal answer, especially on the example of the World Health Organization, which has brought itself under scrutiny by changing approaches often, very often. The imperative is to build a resilient society and build complex systems which are adaptable to external shocks, with high sensitivity to the changes and their impacts to the fundamental values and norms. It is indicative that in September 3rd, Serbia was the country with the best results of sick and deceased in the region when we compare the number of inhabitants in our region. At the same moment, on the same day, Serbia is still on the blacklist and at the very top of Europe in terms of the number of victims in traffic accidents. Despite that, a comparison between coronavirus and other diseases in terms of the number of deaths and the situation in which they are treated cannot be done without a clear definition. That people who have heart disease, for example, cannot pass it on to others. In the case of corona, we have exponential growth, and there is a dramatic difference between infectious disease and others that are not directly transmitted. So some diseases have a higher potential, so-called fat tail phenomenon, for catastrophic events and effects. COVID is an example of how much the perception of a threat influences the shaping of our reality, and also an example of disproportionate response given the scope and intensity of the danger in our post-trust society. Dear friends and colleagues, stay safe and thank you for your attention.
Dear students, dear colleagues, I take this opportunity to thank the Atlantic Council of Croatia for invitation to participate to the project webinar International School, and this webinar with the topic NATO and the crisis management in the Western Balkan region, challenges and perspectives. I would like to thank the organizers, but also to all young people from Croatia and other Western Balkan countries in which young people are very interested in these important topics. Unfortunately, the Western Balkan countries have always been confronted with different security challenges that influence on the security and stability of the whole international community. This fact is very important now during the global pandemic situation. In this sense, I strongly believe that panels that are aimed to encourage debate on the new member countries' position in NATO, through which the process of Euro-Atlantic integrations will be closer to general population and will increase their knowledge about it, are extremely important. This is how we in Montenegro have been organized so many panels, public forums and conferences in order to review and in order to analyze the key threats and challenges to the security and safety of Montenegro, as well as the consideration of the benefits and NATO membership of our country as a new member state in terms of permanent locking security of our country in the system of collective security. Also, the aim of these events is to inform the Montenegrin professional community with all aspects of membership of our country as a young NATO member state, as well as the character of the alliance at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the roles and missions of NATO that NATO has in the war to take compared with other states and other international organizations, with special emphasis on the relationship between NATO and the European Union in the period of global pandemic situation. In this sense, it is very important to understand better the importance of implementation of Euro-Atlantic values in the period of current crisis, especially in the process of fighting against various threats to safety in Montenegro. I would take this opportunity to talk about experience of my country in a sense of overall benefits from Euro-Atlantic integrations, as well as challenges and the perspectives of NATO membership. Montenegro has been in a variety of academic, professional and political debates mentioned as a positive example, as it is often characterized as a bright spot in the Western Balkans in the successful implementation of commitments in the field of accession to various international organizations, the development of good neighbor relations and resolving open issues through peaceful foreign policy means. So from the renewal of independence, the main foreign policy priorities of Montenegro are integration to the EU and NATO, improving and maintaining good neighbor relations and regional cooperation, and development of bilateral and multilateral cooperation. Defined foreign policy priorities of Montenegro are long-term objectives, and they reflect the needs and interests of Montenegro, especially in the political and development terms. Just like the other post-socialist countries after the break of communism, Montenegro has shifted to democratization and establishment of politically and economically prospective society. All reforms that Montenegro is applying in the last few decades, both political and economic, are part of desired development and transformation to the system of modern democracy and open market economy in order to provide stability as a member of NATO and enter European Union. Just to mention that in a very short period of time, Montenegro managed to establish a system of defense, especially when speaking about modernization and process of professionalization of the army. Being fully devoted to Euro-Atlantic integrations, we have achieved really good results in defense and military reforms, which was stated and recognized by NATO experts through so many assessments done from 2008. And just to mention that Montenegro joined the PFP program in December 2006, and the main goals of this process was preparation of our country for full accession to NATO, security system reform, especially the process of professionalization and optimization of security forces, standardization, then achieving interoperability of forces, resources and institutions, participation in joint missions and operations to establish and preserve peace in the world. And the country was invited to join the Membership Action Plan in December 2009, which was realized in many annual cycles through the annual national program, which was consisted of political and social issues, defense and financial issues, military issues, as well as security and legal issues. As you probably know, Montenegro became a full member of the alliance on the 5th June of 2017, and Montenegro actively supports the NATO operation in Afghanistan, then Kosovo and Iraq. When we talk about the benefits of Euro-Atlantic integration of Montenegro, the successful implementation of this process required the harmonization of existing legislation with the standards of NATO countries, and its implementation, strengthening democratic institutions, market economy, and equality of all forms of ownership. Additionally, one of the key conditions that Montenegro successfully met was ensure an appropriate level of support of public opinion to membership. In this process, it was really crucial to meet Montenegrin citizens with all aspects of the integration of Montenegro in NATO, especially from the standpoint of future benefits that members receive, taking into account the permanent locking safety of all possible security threats. The biggest motivation for membership in NATO was the fact that membership would have a favorable effect on economic growth, investment, and living standards, as only membership in NATO was a signal to foreign investors that the country has achieved stability and that their investment would be safe. NATO provides greater stability as well as reducing the risk for foreign investors through increased bilateral cooperation and diplomatic activities, the high rating by international financial institutions and private investors. On the other hand, the membership includes ensuring the safety of all possible security challenges and threats coming from the outside, then the development of Montenegrin military capabilities and military involvement in peacekeeping operation, the introduction of NATO standard weapons, equipment, training, logistics, and overall modernization, and reforming the defense sector of Montenegro in accordance with NATO standards. NATO has done more than any other multilateral organization to promote democracy, to promote peace and security in Europe, as well as in Western Balkan region. In the global pandemic period, member states ensured that NATO can face the challenges of the 21st century, although current geopolitical implications of COVID-19 are very huge. To discuss ways how this virus is changing the international landscape and how the NATO is addressing the challenges it created in terms of health, economy, and security is very important. As NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said a few months ago, NATO will continue to keep all citizens safe, but NATO must become more global because of the three biggest reasons in this period of time. One of them is coronavirus, among terrorism, and the rise of China. So the role of NATO and all its activities against the pandemic are extremely important for the whole world, but especially for our region and young member states as Montenegro is. So NATO's main task during the pandemic is to make sure the health crisis does not become a security crisis. In this period, NATO remained ready and really very well prepared to respond to any threat. NATO's success is to keep forces safe, to sustain missions and operations, as well as to provide support to civilian efforts to cope with COVID-19. Thank you very much for attention, and I wish good luck in this webinar.